last week I was going to pick up one of my children. And you know how sometimes you know that you're going to be in a car with them for about 10 or 15 minutes and you think, this is it. This is my time to kind of nail down a few things that they're not doing very well, and it's time for me to straighten them out. And so I was driving down the road, and I've been listening to this book on relationship skills and at the workplace. And so I thought, yeah, I got 10 minutes to listen to this book. And in this book, it talked about communication spoilers was the name of the chapter. And it talked about 12 things that you don't do to communicate when you communicate with people, like judging, moralizing, and it went through this list of 12 things. And after I listened to the book for the 5 minutes on my way to pick up one of my children, I realized that I couldn't talk to my kids because everything I was going to say was what they talked about in that book. And so I got when I picked them up, I was like, how's it going? And I just tried to listen for the next 5 minutes because I couldn't say what I wanted to say. So I kind of stuffed that away. And so it reminded me, I was listening to a podcast about 2 weeks ago, and I was listening to this guy named Dr. John Deloney, and he is the Dean of Students at Belmont University. And he was talking about what he does in his work. And he said, sometimes I wish I could just go back and talk to my teenage self. And so the guy doing the podcast said, well, okay, let's talk about that. What would you say? And he said, that's a great question. I've done a lot of thinking about it. And here's what I would say. Probably nothing, because they're not going to listen to me. He said, when I was a teenager, I didn't really listen to my parents in the way that I probably should have. I said, but I did realize what I did do is I watched them all the time. I watched what they did. I watched the way they talked. And so, I say this every time I talk to anybody, any parents, is that research shows over and over again the most important person in a child's life is their parents. Not just, as far as growth goes, but as far as how a student or a child looks at their parents, they will say that the parent is the most influential person in their life. Even in high school, when they're a senior in high school, when they would never tell you that, they still believe that the parent is the most influential person in their life. And so it's that comment, that little podcast it made me think, okay, what do my children see me do around the house? If I'm not able, and I'm not saying that we don't need to correct our children, okay? So, but I'm just taking a little portion out here and just kind of highlighting it, magnifying this whole thought about what do our kids see us doing. But I started thinking really today, as I was preparing this, is what do my kids see me do around the house a lot? So we get onto our kids all the time now because they're on their phones all the time, right? It's like, hey, would you get off your phone because we want to have family time around the dinner table. You can't bring the phones to the table. And they're like, oh, and then I think about what they see me doing when I come in the house. And what's the thing that I do after dinner? I reach for my phone and I look to see if I've got any important phone calls, or I do a couple of emails, and I start to think, that's what they see me doing. Or when I come home and I'm so tired that I talked with them at the dinner table and I head over to the couch and I sit down on the couch and I grab that remote control and I just turn on the TV, and for an hour I just sit there and veg out. And I think, okay, if my children just had to think about who their dad was from 5:30 to 8:30, who would they say I was? It's pretty convicting, right? And so that's kind of my word of advice today. And I'm going to close up with one other story, but it made me think about, how do I use my phone? And when I tell my children that they don't need to use their phone, am I using the phone that way? Or when I tell them they don't need to be watching so much TV, they need to read more books, are they seeing me do that? Or if I say that conversation is the most important thing and relationship is most important, am I going and sitting on their bed when they're doing homework and just hanging out with them, because they got a lot of work to do, but at least I could do is sit on their bed and maybe read a book and be next to them, because I really do believe that they watch everything that we do. And rather than telling them what we want them to be, what if we showed them what we wanted to be, what they needed to be? Which reminds me of my favorite story in many situations. And somebody told me this a long time ago. They told me about this guy who was a little boy when he grew up in the Alps. And every day he would go out his back door and he would look, and the mountain front would be right there. And he would look up there, and there was a mountain face right there, and the rock was cut to where it actually looked like an older gentleman in the rock face. And the boy would go up and he would look at it every day. And he'd go out in his teens, he would go out there and he'd eat breakfast and look out. And in his 20s and 30s and 40s, and every day he'd go out and he'd just stare at the rock face to start out his day. And when he got in his upper 60s, one day he was out there just sitting there eating breakfast, and he looked up at the rock face, and a little boy was walking down the street. And he walked past the man, and he looked at the man, and he looked at the mountain, and he looked at the man, he looked at the mountain, and he looked at the man, and he said, "Mister, is that you?" Because the man had looked at the rock face so much that the attributes of his face started to look like that rock face. And I think that's a great lesson for us, is that if we continue to consider who we want to be as people and what kind of leaders and parents that we want to be, and if we emulate those things, and our parents and our children look at us every day and continue to look at us every day, by the time that they leave our house, they will be what we are. And that should be our goal. Not that we preach all the time, but that we emulate the lives that we want to live so much that our children become like that. And so that's my little piece of encouragement for you.